The chapel held its breath. Two women stood on either side of the aisle in Caromere's stone church, and neither of them was standing in the right place, and both of them knew it. Reverend Bartholomew Crane, who had been a bishop these 11 years and had presided over enough weddings to know what ordinary catastrophe looked like, had stepped back from the altar rail and folded his hands at his chest, and was not moving. His face held the particular stillness of a man watching a river shift its bank. Miss Cecily Vane stood to the left, closer to the door, in a gown of white muslin, so plain it might have been a mourning dress with the color bleached away. Her gloves were new, the only new thing she owned, and they did not quite fit at the fingers. She was 24 years old, and had not slept in 2 nights, and she held herself the way a woman holds herself when she has decided to stop expecting the world to be kind. Lady Dorothea Fitch stood at the chancel steps in ice blue silk. She had not been invited. She had arrived 20 minutes ago in a private carriage, accompanied by her solicitor and a maid and a letter. She said she intended to read aloud to the assembly. And at the chapel door, flanked by 2 soldiers in army scarlet, with their hands at the hilts of their swords, stood Edmund Hartwell, Earl of Caromere, with his wrists in irons. He was not looking at the soldiers. He was not looking at Lady Dorothea Fitch, though she had positioned herself so that he would have to. He was looking at Cecily, with the steady attention of a man who has decided, some time ago, which way he means to face. She did not look back. She had learned, these past 3 weeks, that looking back cost too much. The bishop cleared his throat, and the sound carried through the November cold of the nave, like a stone dropped into a well. He said very quietly that he did not believe he could proceed. The word went around the assembly in a murmur, and Lady Penrose, seated in the front pew in dove-gray silk and diamonds too deliberate for a mourning ceremony, pressed her lips together in something that might have been satisfaction. This was the morning of the 5th of November in the year 1816. And the name on Cecily's lips was not the one in the marriage register. And the man she was forbidden to want was standing at the chapel door in chains, and the bishop had just refused to marry anyone to anyone at all. The question, as Cecily would later understand it, was not whether the mourning would be saved. It was whether Edmund would be free when it was. The beginning for Cecily's part had started on a wet Thursday in August, in a solicitor's office on the edge of the village of Hawksley, with the news that her father had died 6 weeks before leaving a debt that would, under the law of the entail she had never been permitted to question, transfer to her person in the form of a betrothal. Her father, Mr. Frederick Vane, had been a gentle and particular man who kept his books in alphabetical order and grew sweet peas in a box outside the window of his study, and believed, until the year he did not recover from winter, that intelligence was its own currency and would be recognized eventually as such. He had been wrong. He had died owing Lord Ashby Penrose, Viscount Penrose, £4,000, and the Viscount's mother had been prompt about the paperwork. The arrangement was simple, as such arrangements always were, which was to say it was simple only if you were not the arrangement. Cecily would marry the Viscount before Michaelmas. The debt would be forgiven. The Vane house would remain in her aunt's possession, which was a kindness Lady Penrose had made it clear she could withdraw at any moment she chose. Cecily's aunt, Mrs. Cess. Aldous had wept when she read the letter, and then pressed her handkerchief to the corner of her mouth and said, with the precision of a woman who had learned to be practical before she could afford not to be, that they had very little room to refuse. Cecily had not wept. She had sat with her hands in her lap and counted the particulars of the study that had been her father's, and was no longer anything, and she had thought about the word forgiven, and how it contained, like a room with a low ceiling, the assumption that something was owed. She had met Lord Penrose twice. He was 29, with easy manners and a habit of looking at a woman's shoulders rather than her face, and the quality of his attention was the quality of a man examining livestock he had already decided to purchase. His mother attended both meetings and spoke for him with the fluency of long practice. The solicitor's daughter, Lady Penrose, had said at the first meeting, to the family's man of business, would find Caromere's village quite adequate for her requirements. She had said the solicitor's daughter, as one says a specific and lesser category of thing, the way one says a hired chair or a rented room. Cecily had noted the phrase. She had not answered to it. She had noted it, and it had settled in her chest, beside the grief for her father, two weights, sharing the same shelf. The rooms she and her aunt were given in the Penrose dower house were adequate, in the precise sense Lady Penrose had promised. They were warm enough. The fire was always laid. The meals were regular and sufficient. The quality of the silence in those rooms, however, had a character that adequate did not cover a silence, made of everything one was not invited to say. It was in the third week of her residence at the dower house that she had first seen the Earl of Carrowmere. She had not intended to be in the library. The house had a library, a real library, not the small collection her father had kept in his study, but a room with shelves to the ceiling and a ladder on a rail in morning light that came through east-facing windows, in a way that made the book spines look almost amber. She had found it on her second day when she was looking for the morning room, and had stood at the threshold long enough to feel the particular ache that comes from wanting something you understand you are not entitled to want. She had gone back on the 16th morning very early, before the household was properly awake in the grey light before the fire was lit. She had taken a volume of natural philosophy from the middle shelf and carried it to the window seat and sat with her feet tucked beneath her, and read for an hour without anyone finding her. She did not hear him enter. The first she knew of another presence in the room was the quality of the silence, changing a stillness that was not absence but attention, and she looked up from her book, and a man she had never seen was standing at the far end of the room with one hand at the card catalogue and the other at his side, quite still watching her read. He was tall, in the manner of men who do not stoop to account for it. He wore riding clothes, still damp at the shoulder, and his dark hair was not yet dressed. His face had the careful composition of a man who had learned to offer very little to the room, and was deciding, in this particular moment, whether to hold to that habit. She should have closed the book, and apologized and left. She knew it. The propriety of the moment was unambiguous, and she had been living these past weeks by the arithmetic of propriety as the only form of safety available to her. She did not leave. She said instead, her voice steadier than she had expected, "There is a second copy on the south shelf, if you need this one." He said nothing for a moment. He said, "I do not need it. The catalogue was what I was looking at." At 6:30 in the morning. "The morning is when I think," he said. And then, as if the words had escaped some private discipline, "You read natural philosophy. My father kept a small library. I read what was in it. That is not an answer to what I asked." "You did not ask," she said. "You observed." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had the quality, rather, of two people discovering that a room they had both assumed to be occupied by one was, in fact, large enough for two. She learned later that he was Edmund Hartwell, Earl of Carrowmere, that the estate at Carrowmere was his, and had been, since his father's death 8 years prior, and that he had been away, first at war, and then at what she gathered were the various complicated inheritances that follow a long military absence, and that his return had been. Until the morning, she found him in the library, unannounced. She also learned from her aunt, who had it from the housekeeper, who had it from the butler who had spoken to the Earl's man of business, that Lord Penrose's claim to a portion of the Carrowmere estate, the grounds on which the betrothal debt had been arranged, was being contested, that the paperwork was not clean, that there was a letter, a sealed letter, written in her father's hand, that had gone to the Earl's solicitor in London rather than to the Penrose family's man of business, and that no one yet knew precisely what it said. Lady Penrose, when this reached her, had visited Cecily that same afternoon. She had sat in the adequate sitting-room, and held her fan at the precise height she always held it, and said, with the warmth of a woman who means to be understood, "My dear girl, you are very nearly settled. Do not permit yourself to be distracted by persons whose interest in your situation is not what it appears." The solicitor's daughter, Lady Penrose told the Reverend Crane in the vestry the following morning, was a sweet child, quite without resources, and easily influenced. Crane had nodded without committing himself, which was all Crane generally did. With Lady Penrose, and Lady Penrose had mistaken his silence for agreement, which was all Lady Penrose generally did with silences. What Cecily did not know was what the library had done to the Earl. She would have denied, if asked, that the library had done anything to either of them. She was not naive. She was not a girl of 17 who had confused courtesy for consequence. She was a woman who understood that the world had decided what she was, and who did not expect the Earl of Carrowmere to contradict the world's verdict on her behalf. The morning she sat outside the nursery window, in the kitchen garden, shelling peas with the cook's 12-year-old niece who was visiting from the village, she had not intended to be observed. The child had been frightened of the cook, and Cecily had taken her outside and given her a task to occupy her hands, and was telling her in a low voice about the properties of sweet peas, which was the thing her father had known best, and which came to her still with the texture of something kept warm. Oh, wow. She had not known he was in the kitchen garden until she stood and turned and found him there, 3 feet away, with a stillness in his face she had not seen before. Not the guardedness of the library. Something older and more certain than that. The stillness of a man whose mind has arrived somewhere, did not expect to arrive, and has stopped to confirm the address. "You are very good with her," he said. "She is a child who needed something to do," Cecily said. "It is not a difficult thing to provide." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray-blue eyes that had the quality of smoke over still water. "No," he said. "I expect it is not. He was not a man who said unnecessary things. She had noticed this early. It meant that what he said was the thing he meant, without the decorative additions that men of his rank often supplied. And it meant that his silences were equally deliberate. The quality of his attention, when he turned it on her, was not comfortable. It was the attention of a man who sees with some precision and does not pretend otherwise, and it was the most honest thing anyone had offered her since her father died. The cook's niece between them had finished her peas and had gone very quiet in the way of children who understand, without being told, that the air between 2 adults has changed. Cecily looked at the child, and the child looked at Cecily, and Cecily said very naturally that they ought to take the bowl inside before the cold got into it, and the child nodded and went. And Cecily and Edmund were alone in the kitchen garden with the October light coming through the espaliered pear trees, and the sound of the estate going about its ordinary business beyond the wall. "She did not fear you," he said after a moment. "Children rarely fear people who give them tasks," Cecily said. "Fear grows in idleness." He was quiet. She did not fill the quiet. She had learned in the weeks she had spent in rooms that were not hers, that silence between people revealed something truer than speech. And what the silence between herself and this man revealed was that neither of them was in any particular hurry to end it. It was the afternoon of that same day that she learned from her aunt what Mrs. Aldous had learned from the housekeeper, which was that the Earl of Carrowmere had been married before, that his wife, a Miss Helena Bryce, whom he had married in the January of 1812, before his regiment sailed for the continent, had died of a fever in the August of that same year in the house at Carrowmere while he was in Spain, that he had not known she was ill until the letter reached him 6 weeks after the fact, because the letter had been delayed, because letters always were, because the distances of war had no interest in the distances of grief. He had not married again. He had come home to an estate he had not been present for, a grief he had not been permitted to be present for either, and a name he carried with the care of a man carrying something that might break if set down carelessly. Cecily did not learn this from him. She learned it in the way she learned most things about him, from the edges and the peripheries, from what other people had been told and had passed on, without understanding why it mattered. She held it carefully. She did not use it as an explanation. She had seen enough of explanations used as a kind of reduction, a way of making a complicated thing into a simple one. And he was not simple. His wound was not simple. It was the wound of a man who had calculated in the years since that the things he could not protect were not things he should be trusted with. And that conclusion was both rational and catastrophically wrong, and she suspected he knew it was wrong and could not yet find the door out. It was also the most dangerous thing in the building. She had understood this clearly. The night the woman arrived, she arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days before the wedding. She came in a carriage with the Fitch crest on the panel, and she came with her mother and a maid, and she was 26 and very beautiful in the way of women who have been told since childhood that beauty is both their inheritance and their argument. She went directly to Lady Penrose, and they were closeted together for 40 minutes, and when they emerged, Lady Penrose had the expression of a woman who has exchanged a rook for a queen. That same evening at dinner, Lady Penrose said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, "Miss Vane, I wonder if you are aware how very comfortable the Vane house is. Your aunt keeps it beautifully, I am told. It would be such a pity to disrupt that arrangement." The table heard it. Cecily heard the table hear it. She kept her hands very still on the cloth, and looked at her plate and said she was grateful for her aunt's comfort. Her voice was level. Her hands were not, but they were hidden by the table, and no one at the table could see that, but the man seated 4 chairs away who had been watching her hands. That was the second voicing. Lady Dorothea had said it first, softly, in the passage outside the drawing room, to her own mother. The solicitor's daughter they've arranged, poor thing. She cannot possibly have known what she was stepping into. Not unkind in tone, which was almost worse. The category of pity, Cecily had learned, was as efficient as contempt. On the morning of the wedding, the morning of the 5th of November, at 6:30, Cecily had been sitting in the vestry anteroom in her white muslin gown with her gloves in her lap when the news reached her by way of the verger, who had heard it from the soldier who had been tasked with passing it to the family. The Earl of Carrowmere had been arrested the previous night on charges of passing false military intelligence to a foreign power in the year 1813. He was being brought to the chapel to be presented to the arresting authority, who was attending the wedding at Lady Penrose's invitation. Cecily had sat with this information for the length of time it took the candle beside her to burn down 1/4 of an inch. Then she had folded her hands and stood and gone to take her place in the nave. She had made no scene. She had not wept. She had arranged herself where the occasion required her, and she had waited, with a stillness that was the only form of power the morning had left her, and she had not looked at the door until she heard the irons. They were a sound she did not know, heavier than she had imagined, a sound with no elegance to it, and the 2 soldiers who escorted him moved with the cautious formality of men who had been instructed that the Earl was dangerous, and had so far failed to observe the danger. Edmund walked between them with his wrists bound, and his back straight, and his face composed in a way that the morning could not disturb. He was wearing his great coat, dark wool, because they had taken him in the night, and beneath it she could see the white of his cravat, and the dark of his waistcoat, and the ordinariness of a man dressed for an ordinary night, now placed in a circumstance that was anything but. He found her immediately, across the length of the nave in the chill November light coming through the clerestory windows. His eyes found her with the directness of a man who has decided which way he means to face. She had thought she had trained herself not to look back. She had been wrong. The bishop stepped back from the altar and folded his hands and said he did not believe he could proceed. Dorothea moved then, with the unhurried confidence of a woman executing a plan she has rehearsed. She produced the letter. Her solicitor, a narrow man with a narrow briefcase, held it open for the assembly to see, and Dorothea read from it in a clear and carrying voice. A betrothal, she said, signed and witnessed in the year 1814, before the Earl's return from the Continent, between her father and his father's estate. The Earl, she said, was bound. The letter, she said, was signed. Lady Penrose, in the front pew, had the expression of a woman watching water pour where she had directed it. And Cecily stood in her plain white gown, with her new gloves that did not quite fit, and heard the assembly murmuring, and heard Lady Dorothea's voice, clear and polished, and quite without malice, and thought that this was where it ended. Not badly. Not with cruelty. Simply with the arithmetic of her situation, arriving at its natural conclusion. It was Lady Dorothea who spoke the third voicing, directly to the bishop in a voice not unkind but placed with surgical precision. The solicitor's daughter was engaged under an arrangement that I understand was quite conditional. Perhaps, Reverend Crane, there is a simpler resolution to this morning than it appears. Crane looked from Dorothea to Cecily, then to Edmund, who had not moved and had not spoken, whose face had changed in a way that was small, but not small at all, a tightening at the jaw, a quality in the eyes that was the opposite of composure. Cecily did not wait to see what the bishop would decide. She walked, quietly, to the vestry door. She was not running. She would not run. She went into the vestry and closed the door behind her, and stood with her back against the old stone wall, and held her own hands, because they were the only hands available, and breathed through her nose, until the cold of the stone reached her through the back of her gown and was company of a kind. The vestry smelled of candle wax and old wood, and the particular damp of a room that is heated only when it is needed. There was a small table with a candle burning on it, and a chair no one was sitting in, and a portrait of some prior incumbent of the diocese whose name she did not know, and the sounds of the nave came through the door muffled and distant, like something happening in another house. She thought about her father. She thought about the kitchen garden and the kitchen garden light. She thought about a man standing at a card catalogue at 6:30 in the morning, with his riding coat still damp at the shoulder, watching her read and choosing not to announce himself. She thought about Helena Bryce, who had been 20 years old when she married a man who was about to sail for war, and who had been 21 when she died. In August, in a house on the edge of an estate, while the man she had married was 6 weeks of letter travel away. She thought about the particular arithmetic of that grief, how it did not resolve, how it accumulated interest in the way of debts that have no mechanism for repayment. She thought he had carried it well. She had not seen how heavily, until she knew what he was carrying. The new gloves did not quite fit at the fingers. She was aware of this in the way one becomes aware of minor physical discomforts when the larger discomfort has been set aside, not because it is resolved, but because it is too large to hold directly. She took the right glove off and pressed her palm flat against the cold of the stone wall, and let the stone hold the warmth of her hand for a moment, which was something her father had taught her to do on the occasions when the world was too loud and the interior too full, and you needed a simple and material fact to organize yourself around. This was a good wall, very old. Not interested in November or in the question of which woman was meant to be standing in a chapel, Mrs. Aldous found her there 3 minutes later. Her aunt was a small woman with capable hands and a face that had been doing practical work for 52 years, and she came in and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said there was a solicitor in the porch. Cecily looked at her. "Not Penrose's man," her aunt said. "A Mr. Oakes from London. He says he has been waiting on the Earl's instructions for this morning. Specifically, he says he has a letter." "What letter?" "He says," her aunt said carefully, "that it was written by your father." The thing about grief, Cecily had found, was that it did not arrive all at once. It was parceled, delivered across a long sequence of ordinary moments, and sometimes it arrived inside a thing that should have been happiness. The mention of her father's name in the cold vestry of a chapel where she had been about to marry the wrong man, for the practical reasons that the world supplied in abundance to women without options, came at her from a direction she had not fortified, and she stood very still and waited for the wave to pass. She had known about the sealed letter. She had known since the 3rd week of her residence at the Dower House, when the rumor reached her by way of the housekeeper that her father had written to the Earl's solicitor rather than to the Penroses. She had not known what it contained. She had told herself, carefully and repeatedly, that it did not matter, because the engagement was the engagement, and the arithmetic was the arithmetic, and hoping was the thing that hurt the most. She had been wrong about that too. She went back into the nave. The assembly had not resolved itself in her absence. Crane was still at the altar rail, still with his hands folded, with the expression of a man who is less confused than he appears, and is waiting for the room to produce its own answer. Lady Dorothea's solicitor was still holding the betrothal letter, Lady Penrose had risen from her pew and was speaking in a low, precise voice to the arresting officer, a Captain Fellows, who was nodding with the expression of a man who has been told what to do and has not yet decided whether to do it. Edmund was watching the door. He had been watching the door. The moment she came through it, his attention shifted in a way that the room could see, a change in his posture so small that only a person paying close attention would notice it. And she was paying close attention. She had been paying close attention to this man for 3 weeks, and she noticed. She walked past Lady Dorothea. She walked past Lady Penrose. She walked, because there was no other direction that made any sense toward the chapel door, where a short, broad man with a London briefcase and the face of a man who has been traveling since before dawn was standing in the porch with his hat in his hands. "Miss Vane," said Mr. Septimus Oakes. "Mr. Oakes," she said. He opened his briefcase and produced a letter in an envelope she recognized. The particular cream of the stationery her father had used for formal correspondence, with the seal in dark wax. "Your father wrote this in the July of 1815, he said. He instructed me to deliver it, on the occasion of any attempt to enforce the Penrose debt, as a betrothal contract. He further instructed me that if the Earl of Carrowmere were ever presented with a charge of military malfeasance, I was to present the contents of this secondary packet alongside it." He produced a second, thicker envelope. The Earl, I should tell you, was aware of the second packet. He arranged the instruction with your father before the debt was transferred. Cecily looked at the 2 envelopes. "My father knew," she said. "Your father knew a great deal, Miss Vane, and chose to place it in the keeping of a solicitor, rather than a family that had already shown its willingness to misuse what it was given." She took the first envelope. She did not open it here. She held it with both hands and turned to the assembly. She said his name into the room, Bishop Crane. Crane looked at her. "This is Mr. Septimus Oakes of Lincoln's Inn. He has been retained by my father's estate and by the Earl of Carrowmere jointly. He has documents that are relevant to this morning." She kept her voice even. It was the voice she had used in the kitchen garden with the cook's niece, the voice she had used in the library, the voice she used when the task was too important for the expression of feeling. I believe the bishop's hesitation was correct. The room had gone very quiet. It was Edmund who spoke, then from the chapel door. He had not spoken to the room since he entered it. He had stood with his wrists in irons and his back straight, and had given the assembly nothing to work with. Now he looked at Captain Fellows, and his voice was quiet and level and absolutely certain. "She is my wife," he said, "and you will unchain me now." The silence that followed was the most significant silence Cecily had ever occupied. Captain Fellows said, without any particular surprise as a man says a thing he has been waiting for the room to tell him, "Under what authority, my lord?" "Under the authority of a prior and valid marriage, registered at the parish of St. Giles in the county of Berkshire on the 3rd of October, 1816, witnessed by Mr. Dan Oakes and by Major Daniel Thorpe, retired, and certified by the vicar of that parish." He had not looked away from the captain. "The dispatch I am accused of passing was copied by Lord Penrose's household secretary from documents he was not entitled to see, then altered, then presented to the War Office under a name not his own. Mr. Oakes has the originals." Oakes opened the second, thicker envelope and removed 3 documents and held them where the room could see them. Lady Penrose said, with the precision she had maintained all morning, "This is absurd." Edmund turned to look at her. "For the first time, the altered dispatch has a specific error in its transcription. The name of the river crossing is misspelled. The misspelling appears in correspondence from your household to the War Office, dated the 15th of September. It does not appear in my original dispatch, which is dated the 12th. He returned his gaze to the captain. "If you require me to remain in irons while the documents are examined, I will remain in them. I will remain, however, beside my wife." Cecily became aware that she had forgotten to breathe. She became aware that she had been aware of this man's presence at the edge of every room for 3 weeks, and that she had been, carefully and repeatedly, and with the thoroughness of someone who knew the cost of hoping, wrong, refusing to name what that awareness was. Captain Fellows looked at the documents Oakes held. He looked at Edmund. He looked at the irons. He was a methodical man with a methodical expression. He made his decision in the particular way that methodical men make decisions, which is to say, he made it correctly. He nodded to his soldier, and the irons came off. Edmund crossed the nave in the quiet of the room's held breath. He did not hurry. He moved with the deliberateness of a man who has been waiting on the world's permission and has decided that the waiting is over. He stopped beside Cecily and looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and the particular private texture of his face, the thing beneath the composure that she had been noticing for 3 weeks and refusing to name, was entirely visible now. "You married me," she said. "It was not a question." "I married you on the 3rd of October, he said, "with your father's letter as the instrument and your father's solicitor as the witness, because the alternative was allowing a debt that your father had written to invalidate before his death, to be used against you by people who had no legitimate claim. That was," she said carefully, "a significant decision to make on my behalf." "It was," he agreed. "I intend to spend some time making it up to you, if you will allow it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at their joined hands, which she had not noticed, joining but which were joined nonetheless, his fingers over hers in a grip that was not ceremony but fact. "I will allow it," she said. The bishop, who had been waiting with the patience of a man who had suspected all along that the morning would eventually produce its own answer, stepped back to the altar, with the expression of a man who has been prevented from doing something unnecessary and is grateful for it. Lady Penrose did not speak again. She sat with her fan closed, and her diamonds catching the November light, and her face composed in the expression of a woman who has encountered a room that refused to behave as rooms were supposed to behave. She was not a cartoonish person. She had operated, all her life, inside a system that had always rewarded what she offered it, and the system had simply on this particular morning encountered something it could not categorize. Dorothea, who had the intelligence that beauty sometimes obscures and sometimes accompanies, read the documents Oakes held, in the particular sequence that made their meaning clear, and then refolded them and handed them back with the composure of a woman who has lost a game she had not been informed she was playing. She said to no one in particular that she would require her solicitor to write to the War Office on the matter of the altered dispatch. It was, the room understood, her way of exiting correctly. She did so with her mother and her maid and her narrow briefcase solicitor. Through the chapel's side door, in the gray November light that asked nothing of anyone, Captain Fellows remained long enough to take copies of the relevant documents and to note, in his field book, that the charge against the Earl of Carrowmere required review pending submission of the originals to the War Office. He was efficient and professional, and entirely without imagination, which made him precisely correct for the task. Lord Penrose, who had arrived for his own wedding and had been present in the chapel for 20 minutes without anyone addressing him directly, rose from the pew where he had sat through all of it and walked out through the main door without speaking. Lady Penrose followed, in the careful dignity of a woman who has not been defeated, only corrected. The assembly, which had consisted of perhaps 30 people, none of whom would ever entirely forget the 5th of November of that year, began in the particular way of assemblies whose occasion has resolved itself, without their participation, to disperse. Crane came forward. He asked with the tactful gravity of a man who had been a bishop for 11 years and had seen a great deal, and was still capable of being surprised by the ingenuity of the legal and the human, whether the ceremony at St. Giles had been conducted in all the proper form. Oakes confirmed that it had been. Crane nodded. He said there was nothing then for the chapel to do, except note the marriage in the register. He said it with the equanimity of a man closing a book he was glad to have open. Aldous sat in the pew nearest the door and pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, and did not weep because she was a practical woman, but it was a very near thing. That afternoon, in the library, where the morning light had given way to a gray November dusk, and the fire had been lit, and the candles had been placed on the writing table, Cecily opened her father's first letter. It was not long. Her father had not been a man who used many words when few were served. He had written that the debt to Penrose was invalid, that he had the documents to demonstrate it, and had sent them to Oakes with instructions, and that he was sorry for the months of uncertainty she would have endured before the documents produced their effect. He had written that he understood she might have found ways to survive that uncertainty that cost her more than they should have. He had written that he hoped she had found in the interim something worth surviving for. He had written, in the final line, in the particular handwriting she knew as well as she knew her own, "Your worth, my dear, was never what it owed. It was always what it was." She sat for some time with the letter on her lap, and the fire crackling, and the light of the candles making the book spines look almost amber. Edmund came and sat beside her. He did not ask what the letter said. He was not a man who asked for things he understood she would offer in her own time. He simply sat, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against her shoulder, and waited with the patience of a man who has learned, somewhere, the long sequence of difficult years, that the right kind of waiting is its own form of devotion. After a while she put the letter carefully in the inside pocket of her father's old writing case, which she had kept through everything which she had kept when there was almost nothing else left to keep. She looked at the fire. "He knew about you," she said. "He wrote to me," Edmund said, "in the June before he died." She turned to look at him. His face in the firelight had the particular quality it had in the kitchen garden, the quality of a man whose mind has arrived somewhere and stopped to confirm the address. He said, Edmund continued, his voice low and level, that he had a daughter who read natural philosophy, and kept her counsel, and had more intelligence than the world had been permitted to know about. He said she would need no rescue. He said she might need a witness. Cecily held very still. "I am a slow reader of certain things," he said. "I have been called so. I have been paying attention since June, and I understood what he meant." "He was a very good solicitor," she said. "He was," Edmund said. "He was also, I think, a very good father." She turned back to the fire. The letter was in the writing case. The writing case was in her hands. The candles were burning steadily, and outside the library windows the November night had come fully down, and the first cold stars were visible above the bare trees of the Carrowmere parkland. And this was her house now, this room with its amber book spines and its easy warmth, the home she had not expected and had not permitted herself to want. She leaned very slightly against the warmth of his shoulder. He did not make much of it. He was not a man who made much of the things that mattered. He simply settled, as if they had been sitting this way for years. And the fire went on burning, and the writing case stayed warm in her hands, and the night outside the windows held its quiet. And that was enough. That was everything.